Thank you, Doug. And thank you, everyone else at the Urbanist. My name is Andrew Grant Houston, but you're free to call me Ace. I am known as Ace the Architect on Twitter. And it really dials back to the work that I do, which is organizing. It's really how I came to know the Urbanist. And why I've been such a fan of the Urbanist in the past is because it is a true journal and advocacy platform for many individuals who are trying to push for change in our cities so that we can afford to live here in the places that we love, that we are able to be safe in public space, which means we're able to walk, bike, or roll, knowing that we won't get hit by a car, and that we are able to enjoy the outdoors without having to drive out to the mountains. And so in many ways, what my vision and goal when I become mayor is really continuing the hard work and fighting that I have been doing since I moved here, which is for us to finally, in the apartment ban across the city, that we finally finish all of the bike lanes and transit projects that we have committed to, and that we go even further so that we can achieve a vision that is inherently as close to the 15-minute city ideal, knowing that we have to significantly reduce our carbon emissions really by half or more by the end of the next mayor's 2 terms. And so what I bring that no other current leading candidate brings is my lived experience as a lifelong renter raised by a single parent, my experience never having learned how to drive, and so always being transit dependent or walking, and my experience as an architect and project manager, someone who has tried desperately to get housing built in this city and recognizes that in order to truly address our housing crisis, we need to systematically change the way that we do things here. And so I hope that I can get your vote and your support, and we can finally get to work.
All right. Are we moving on to questions?
Sure, let's go.
All right. I think I speak for many of us when I say that one of our current mayors failing is a lack of vision.
Oh, yes.
If elected, what would be your big picture vision for a city? And then looking back in 4 or 8 years in office, what specifically are your big things you would have hoped to have accomplished?
So I will say that I have a lot of ideas. And part of the conversation that I would love to have today, and especially more in our free time, is really getting into the nitty-gritty of land use reform. So I know that, for example, we need to allow for our 4 floors and corner stores to exist on every single lot in the city if we're truly going to address the housing crisis, like a housing crisis. And we also need to eliminate parking requirements across the city. And so those are very, very big steps to take, but I recognize that they are necessary and they may not be politically popular because, as we know in the past, that there have been mayors like Ed Murray who have walked back proposals related to ending exclusionary zoning because it was not politically popular. I'm not running to do the politically popular thing. I'm running to do the just thing, the environmentally just thing, the climactically just thing, the just thing when it comes to housing. And so that is why I kind of sit everything in the 15-minute city concept, recognizing that what we're trying to get at is complete communities. And in that way, we are able to have a vision that is aligned where we all get to see the neighborhoods that we want to see, recognizing that we must change from our current structures in order to achieve those goals.
Great. So you're talking about, looking at single family zoning. And you said 4 floors and a corner store. I think eliminating single family zoning means lots of different things to lots of different people, from just allowing like backyard cottages to 4 floors and a corner store. Or I know a couple people who would say like 7 stories everywhere in the city. Like what does that mean to you?
So I am not going to come out with an initial proposal for a Parisification of the entire city. Though I do agree that is definitely a viable option. And one of the reasons for that is that the way that we construct housing in general, and I know this as an architect, is that it takes somewhere between 3 to 5 years, ideally, 4 to 6 years more in our process. And we want that to last for 50 to 75 years. And at the rate that we are growing as a city, if we just say, oh, well, we're going to put a couple ADUs over here, and oh, we're going to like add like up to 6 stories right at the new light rail station, but only like the first block and not the second block or the third block away from the light rail station, it is not enough. We need to be more forward thinking and push to have something that is even grander than that. And so recognizing that the major comprehensive plan is just about to start and kick off, and so the next mayor is going to be the one truly guiding that program, I have come out and said, look, we are going to allow for up to 8 units on every single lot, and you can have an option for commercial on the first floor. And the reason for that is that it is just enough so that you can spread out the amount of growth that we are going to see in enough space. And we start to get to a point where our neighborhoods are more equitable. Because currently, and in the past with the urban village strategy, we have focused all development downtown in the neighborhood, in our Black and brown neighborhoods, and right by polluting industrial areas. And that is unacceptable. We can't do that anymore.
What you said, the next mayor is really going to be the one responsible for shepherding through the comprehensive plan update. And beyond that, what would you hope to accomplish in a new comprehensive plan?
Well, housing is my #1 priority, and that really ties as well to transportation, knowing that they go hand in hand, and you really have to have those two pieces come together in a way that is truly intersectional. I look at all of the organizing and the work that's been done related to Seattle Subway, related to Seattle Greenways, people that I organize with all the time. I'm also a member of the Transit Writers Union. And so really digging down and saying, okay, well, if we're going to have bus rapid transit, it needs bus only lanes to be the entirety of the route. If we are going to have complete communities for every single neighborhood to have all the things that it needs, we need to have a vision in our comprehensive plan that expands access for foods. That means more farmers markets, access to technology and opportunities. That means more libraries than we currently have, and access to digital resources, as well as access to more community centers, knowing that the community centers can also serve as fresh air centers during our wildfires.
That's great. So you talked about housing and the housing process, and you also said your background is architecture. Developers and housing advocates alike have expressed frustration with the Seattle process overall, and then specifically the design review process.
Like me.
Yeah. So what as mayor would you like to see changed?
So to color this context, and so that everyone is under the same understanding that's in this room right now, I am someone who, before starting my own practice, worked on the Madison Valley PCC project. That project started at the end of 2015 with like the first contract signed. And we are now in 2021, and we have yet to break ground because it has been appealed so many times. The design review process is broken, and it is broken because we know that wealthier, wider neighborhoods are able to appeal and use their money to stop development from happening, to stop new homes from coming into their neighborhoods, which is really what they're doing. And so that forces development to happen in other places, like the South End, where people simply don't have the same resources to try and stop that development. And so what I am focused on is not honestly trying to fix a broken system, but in shifting in a way that truly makes more exceptions to that system, which is if we are going to say, okay, no design review for this kind of projects, what are the projects that we want to see that should bypass design review entirely? So the biggest one for me is net zero projects, which is what I would love to see more of. We know as a community that, and I know this firsthand as an architect, that new projects, new buildings create new carbon emissions. And so if we say we're going to allow you to build new housing and you can design it as you would like, as long as it does not add to our carbon balance, then I think that's a really good thing. The other thing that I know from the design standpoint is that a lot of the things that you want to do in order to reduce your energy usage, the biggest one being that you really just want a dumb box. And I know Mike Eliason has talked about this before. That goes completely against the rules of design review. And so I will agree with many other people and say that design review needs to be reformed, but that is going to take significant time. And if we need to build a lot of housing very quickly, let's incentivize the most sustainable housing that we can produce. Patrick, you're muted.
Thank you. So a lot of the growth we're talking about and how we accommodate it is fueled by Seattle's tech boom. And this has led to, rapid increase in housing prices and rent and other costs of living. And then it's along with it, gentrification and displacement. It's talked about a lot, and there's been lots of efforts to mitigate it. But people are still being forced out of the city in many cases onto our streets. How do you try to help the people who can't keep up with the cost of living in our city, and how do we maintain those communities that are most at risk of displacement?
Well, I think the biggest thing that comes to mind for me is recognizing that we can't build housing at the same rate as we increase jobs. And that's just a fact. It's extremely easy for Amazon to say, okay, in the next year, we're going to hire 10,000 new people. It is much more difficult for the city to come in and say, okay, we're going to bring in and build another 10,000 units. We just don't do that. That being said, we should be focusing on anti-displacement policies. So for me, that includes challenging the state ban on rent control. That includes increasing our minimum wage. And that includes building short-term solutions for our unhoused neighbors, which include tiny homes. And so in that way, we are trying to work towards harm reduction and to get some of the problem under control. The other thing I really want to emphasize is, of course, both getting significant amounts of investment, which I hope to see and have been trying to organize for at the state and federal level in terms of funds, so that we as a city can acquire land and just start building social housing. One of the proposals that I have, which would build on our now allowed income tax, is to build a new public development authority, which is solely focused on creating sustainable, ideally net zero housing. And so in that way, we are not just asking the market to take care of the situation, we are also building that public social housing, which we should have had in the first place.
Great. So you just talked about our unhoused neighbors. We all know the ultimate solution to homelessness is housing. But even if we had all the money, it would take a long time to build the housing. So, and one question is, where do we get the funding to build housing for a long-term solution? And how do we help end people's suffering and get people inside in the meantime?
Well, I'll be honest and say that the one thing that I recognize as an architect is just how expensive housing is to build. It is probably somewhere currently around $350,000 per unit of housing in order to build it. And the one thing that I feel like a lot of people don't recognize is that affordable housing is actually much more expensive, because you have to try and pull money from a bunch of different pots, and that money can expire, and just a lot of the systems that we use in order to fund these projects are just not set up to drive the costs down. In addition, we are also a city that should be mindful of paying people a living wage. And these are also great opportunities for us to incorporate our communities to help build their own communities and invite more neighbors. And so that is why I'm focused not just on trying to develop progressive sources of revenue locally, but also organizing at the state and working with our federal partners in pushing things like the Thrive Act to provide us those millions of dollars that we need in order to build these projects. One of the biggest things in my mind right now that I would love us to organize around is the Lowe's site that's by Mount Baker Station, because I looked at the price of that land, and the price of the land itself is about $80 million. And so that's not something that the city currently has. Like, they could just say like, oh yeah, we're just going to drop 80 million and be able to purchase this. But it's something that we should be pushing for and should try and organize and rally around. And when it comes to the short-term solution for our unhoused neighbors, which is, for me, 2,500 tiny homes, I've already done those calculations. You can look at that policy plan. It's on my website, but it's going to take us less than 4% of our general fund to be able to operate those year over year. And so when you're looking at something that's going to cost us 4% versus the charter amendment that's being proposed, which is just like, we're just going to throw 12% of whatever we have at the problem. As someone who works with budgets all the time and knows how to build housing, I believe that I can find much more efficient ways of us to achieve our goals of ending homelessness.
Great. Someone in the chat just asked about, how do you hope to bring everyone along with you? And we're obviously have a lot of diverse views in our city. And how do you overcome NIMBY opposition? How do you overcome entrenched white homeowners to both, provide more housing options, to locate more affordable housing, to build tiny house villages? Or does it even matter? Is there a consensus that doesn't need to include their opinions?
Well, I think the biggest thing that was really pointed out to me in the last year, specifically tied around budgets, like all the budgets that we went through, the adjusted 2020 and the proposed 2021 budget, is that council can all align, all 9 individuals, and say, yes, we want to fund this new program. We think it's great. And the mayor can basically stall, hem and haw, and stop something from happening. And so in my mind, that shows that the mayor has a significant amount of power to actually make things happen as well. And so in that way, I feel like I don't necessarily have to organize and to come to the table with a lot of wealthy white homeowners. Who I really need to talk to and really engage with are those council members who will be passing the legislation. And so in that way, I feel like I am in a better place, mostly because many of them have come out in support of making drastic shifts to the way that we operate land use in the city. Furthermore, my background as someone who actually used to write land use codes for other cities is that I have this very deep systematic understanding of how to address the problem. And so one of my biggest things for land use reform is actually to reduce the amount of pages that we have so that anyone can truly be able to design and develop projects in the city. And in that way, I can go to wealthy white homeowners and say, look, you have this great opportunity to build additional wealth on the property that you own. Will you be a part of the solution?
Thanks. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk some more about transportation, which I think you started getting into earlier. So Seattle Department of Transportation is a giant agency with lots of responsibilities and constituencies, all asking for more funding. And if elected, the nearly $1 billion Move Seattle Transportation Levy, which funds a lot of our programs, would be expiring during your term. How would you prioritize spending within the agency? And what would you hope to see in a possible successor to the Move Seattle Levy?
So my number one priority when it comes to transportation when entering office is to ensure that we keep all the promises that we made through the Move Seattle Levy. There have been a number of times in the past few budgets where that money has been rated for other projects, and I know where it's gone, and we need to reverse that trend. And so that is my number one priority there. when it comes to a future Seattle levy, we have to go bigger than we have before. It is something where in this decade of the Green New Deal, we need to be building significant infrastructure projects. And that doesn't just mean highways and roads. That includes sidewalks, that includes fully protected bike lanes so that anyone of any age can feel safe being able to ride in our city. And that's going to take a lot of money. But the thing that I truly bring to this conversation is being able to look at this as an intersectional way and be able to say, hey, if we're going to try and win a bigger levy, we have to fulfill the promises that we made in our past levy. And so that is my number one priority, both for that one, as well as some of our other levies as well.
You mentioned sidewalks, and big swaths, including the neighborhood I live in South Seattle, have either incomplete or unprotected or lacking sidewalks, and huge chunks of North Seattle. The number I feel like I heard is north of $1 billion to build out Seattle's, to give everyone, real sidewalks. Do you have a plan for how to get there? It seems like it's something that gets forgotten.
So the thing that I am looking at is our bonding capacity, because it seems like through our utility bonding capacity, we might be able to take care of this. And the reason I raise that in particular is that not only are we missing sidewalks in our existing city, but if we are going to address any of the unincorporated King County and bring them in, we also need to provide them sidewalks as well. And so that, coupled with the need for infrastructure upgrades, which in my mind is something that is a public utility and I don't feel like it's going to be better served if we're trying to say like, we are requiring piecemeal developers to come in and upgrade like a part of a sewer here and a part of a line here for water. I would rather the city just take on that responsibility and then shift that burden back over to property taxpayers. And so in that way saying, okay, we're going to have this big infrastructure upgrade where we take care of all the things that we need to upgrade and improve and renew in our streets, which includes our water lines, our stormwater lines, our gas lines potentially. I know that we need to decarbonize, and so we need to start that process. And of course, resurface and repave our roads and sidewalks.
Thanks. So even before you started running, you threw out like a really ambitious map for transit improvements in our city.
Yep.
And I think everyone admits, and Seattle's grown so fast in the last few years, and that our mass transit system is not kept up. It's not as robust as it needs to be. Ballard and West Seattle are still years out. How can we both speed the delivery of transit and expand our vision, and how do we pay for it all?
So speeding delivery is definitely number one priority for me. And part of that would be looking at if we're able to bring online part of the line towards Ballard earlier. And the reason for that in my mind is that we have our new arena, which is about to open up, and we're expecting a bunch of people to basically drive their cars to the arena or take the light rail to the monorail, transfer to the monorail, get off at the Armory, and then head into the arena. There's a lot of moving parts there that I feel like could be much more easily solved with providing more transportation options. And so I want to try and speed up the process as much as I can. That's a bigger conversation that needs to happen between SDOT and Sound Transit. And I feel like that's part of the issue, is that conversation between those two groups never really happened. And so we need to really break down those silos, because if we are going to be planning for significant investments in additional housing, which I know is one of the issues why the newer stations cost so much, that we need to truly be doing that coordination, not just through our major comprehensive plan process, but also through our neighborhood planning. And so earlier you did mention like, how are we going to improve design review? I'm not really interested in improving design review, because I would rather shift towards bringing back neighborhood planning in a much more forward-thinking way, where we invite our communities to say, okay, look, we must change from here to the future. And we know there are certain things that we want, which would be being within a mile walk bike roll of a light rail station, or being within a quarter mile of a bus stop. Let's actually start to do that forward planning now, so that we save money for future designs and development of major transportation systems.
Thanks. So in addition to limited funding, there is also a fundamental space limitation for bikes, pedestrians, buses, and cars all needing to share the limited right of way. How do you prioritize, who gets it? And when it comes down to it, when there's not everyone can fit in, what sort of thinking do you use to make that call?
Let's just say that cars are at the bottom, and specifically single occupancy vehicles. Something that I have noticed, especially going through the 2018 greenhouse gas emissions inventory from the city, so extremely wonky because I'm an extremely wonky person, is that over 50% of our carbon emissions come specifically from people driving in their car alone. Not even freight, not including buses, just people driving in their car alone. And so we need to be prioritizing significantly to increase and improve our pedestrian facilities, increase and improve our bike facilities, finally provide those bus-only lanes that we truly need for some of our major routes. I don't know about you, but I ride the 8 all the time. I am frustrated when it is stuck in traffic, and I have not been more happier in my life than sitting on the 8 going eastbound in South Lake Union as we just pass every single person waiting in their car. It is a beautiful experience, and I feel like the more opportunities that we get people to be able to have that experience, that they will truly then understand why we are making these priorities.
Thanks. So you just mentioned climate change in your response. Yeah. And you recently wrote an article for the Urbanist about climate change legislation. It's very clear that our cities, state, and national governments are failing to act remotely adequately to respond to the challenges we face. And
that's exactly why I'm running.
Yeah, I was going to say one of the hallmarks of your campaign seems to be like, how do we respond to it? So what actions would you take as mayor to address climate change? And because this is a regional and state problem, how do you think you could use that position to influence, our county, region, state?
So I am looking at becoming mayor of Seattle as an opportunity to not just lead in the county, not just lead in the state, but to be a true leader on climate action in the entire country. Currently, we have a lot of mayors who have been involved with an organization called C40, which includes our own mayor, which touts itself as climate action. And I will be very clear and say that I have seen the reports that come out of C40, and they are fantastic. The data and the research is there. And we know even locally, we've done the data and the research as to what we need to do. We just need someone who's actually going to act and do it. And so that is what I hope to do, is to fulfill those empty promises that we have made in the past, and break the cycle of the Seattle process, really, at the end of the day, because I am tired of having the same conversation every single year. Meanwhile, the wildfire season gets longer and longer. This is specifically why I have decided to run as an architect and not trying to go for a council position or start somewhere small as a future career politician. That's not what I'm doing. I am specifically running to try and reduce our carbon emissions by as much as possible by 2030. That is why I'm running.
So you mentioned a whole lot of policy positions that have just been sitting unused. Like what are those, and what would what would be your legislative agenda for addressing it specifically?
Let's see, the bicycle master plan, the pedestrian master plan, completing the Center City connector finally. Let's see what else. There was some Black Brilliance.
The C40 climate change, and you said the climate change recommendations too. And those are definitely all part of it, and like making sure it's safe to get around without a car. But
yep. And the number one for me is bringing it back to that 15-minute city concept, which is really, we need to allow for more housing to happen in every single neighborhood in our city. It is something where, for me, ideally, a barista working in Magnolia should be able to afford to live in housing in Magnolia if they choose to do so. That is the point of housing that we need to get to, and where I want to go.
So you think one of the main things the city can respond to climate change is by embracing a 15-minute city, getting past needing to travel by car to get the basic
Exactly.
necessities. That's your.
And the biggest thing for that is also looking at our energy code, which I have done through my work with Councilmember Teresa Mosqueda. We just passed the latest updates to the energy code, and we went further than I think a lot of people even thought we were going to. And so I'm proud to have been a part of that process. And as I normally do in my regular organizing and as a member of FutureWise, we have pushed really hard for HB 1099, which unfortunately did not pass, which would have been input in climate in the Growth Management Act, but we're still going to come back next year for the second part of session. And we were able to pass HB 1220, which requires for housing at every single level to be planned for in cities across the entire state. And so that is how I'm showing how I'm already being a leader and how I'm going to act in terms of making significant change and improvements in our city that have not been seen by any mayor before.
Excellent. Someone just brought up in the chat congestion pricing, which is another thing that could be an aspect of, reducing car usership. What's your feelings on that? And I know in the past, I think Sawant and others have raised the issues of equity and transit and car dependent people living in far off suburbs who do a lot of the low paid work in our city because they can't afford to live here.
I am not interested in the concept because I feel like it is too nitty gritty. But what I would really want to focus on is what the issue is, which is we have way too many people driving in and out of downtown in a way where they're not actually treating downtown like a neighborhood. And so I want to reverse all of our one-way streets, most likely excluding Pike and Pine, but convert them back to two-way streets so that we start to actually have the streets of downtown act like streets where people are supposed to be, not just thoroughfares for cars to get through. And so I feel like if we do that, we are going to increase traffic. And in that way, people are going to say, you know what, maybe I don't need to drive downtown to get to work. Maybe I can take a bus instead. Oh, the new light rail opened up. Maybe let's take that instead. And so in that way, we also help with the reimagining, redeveloping of downtown so that it becomes an actual neighborhood as opposed to simply a place where people go to work.
That's interesting. I've seen like Renton and Redmond and other smaller cities are doing that to make their downtowns more pedestrian friendly, but I've never heard anyone bring that up for Seattle.
Yeah, no, we got to do it.
It's just taken as a given that downtown needs to move the cars. So staying on climate change, you brought up the energy code. And as an architect, you know that and the built environment is such a major source of CO2 emissions. I've also heard a lot of people, because being in the field as well, fret as they try to beat the new energy code because of the cost implications. How do we move our building closer to passive house and net zero while also, trying to fight for affordability?
Well, I think part of it goes to what the city can do to reduce the cost of development. And that means making permitting faster, making permitting easier. And I know this firsthand as an architect. What I will say about passive house, and I say this as a certified passive house designer myself, is that a lot of it comes down to us not having the technology and the understanding like other countries. In other words, it's similar to a cell phone or a TV, where once you actually do it enough times, the cost comes down significantly. And so that is part of what I would want this new public development authority that I plan on creating to do, is actually go out and get that research and get those front of line, most sustainable practices and bring them back to Seattle, because not only are we then able to reduce the cost of our development and still make it sustainable, we can be a leader in clean tech and building technology. And in that way, we become experts ourselves. We're able to build additional jobs as we are.
Excellent. Switching topics again a little bit. You mentioned earlier when we were talking about the comprehensive plan, how to make our vision for growth more equitable. I know, equity and racial justice is also been a big focus of your activism. What would that mean? What would it mean to you, and how would you bring that lens into the mayor's office?
So for me, that starts with making the playing field equal. And so that is the 4 floors and corner stores on every single lot in the city. And working back from that in a method of harm reduction. So that is recognizing, okay, how do we allow individuals in the South End to own property to be able to develop? Let's push for a public bank, which is something that I'm organizing with and pushing for at the state level, so that people can get financing that is much more affordable and also creates a circular economy here within the city. What are ways in which we can recognize that development is going to happen and that people are going to get taken out of apartments that they're currently renting? I want to expand on an existing program and create what I'm calling a developer displacement mitigation fee. And so in essence, incentivizing developers to not simply take an existing 3-story apartment building that has like 20 beds and turn that into 40 beds, but take an existing single family home with 3 bedrooms and turn that into 40 beds. And so in that way, trying to tip the scales a little bit more. And then of course, I touched on this earlier, but we just need rent control. We absolutely need it in order to start to bring a much more stable and predictable method for people to be able to know how much they're going to pay in rent, because currently the rent is just too damn high.
So rent control is another thing that can mean a lot of different things to different people. I know Oregon and Washington passed like a pretty soft rent control where I think it's, what is it, like 7% in 1 year plus inflation, and like new buildings are exempt for 20 years. And then there's also a more extreme where in cities where it's like a board that sets the maximum amount that can be basically like inflation or a little bit below inflation or a little bit above inflation. When you say rent control, what would be your vision for it?
Yeah, I'm looking at something that is essentially rent stabilization, so tied to inflation and an additional amount, taking into account that there needs to be some kind of maintenance, but at the same token, a lot of what also needs to happen is increasing the funding for our tenant protections and ensuring that even in our existing apartments, that we are enforcing the amount of maintenance, the amount of operation that should be happening in the first place.
Excellent. So getting back to the topic of racial justice, and we were just coming off of a summer, last summer of the Black Lives Matter movement, and people are hoping to turn that into real change at our city level. Many people have called for a 50% cut to the police, but people also want an alternative. So when they call 911, the only response isn't a cop with a gun. What specifically do you think a re-envisioned public safety system should look like in our city?
So I want to say that we have a lot of great examples from other cities that have been mentioned before, which includes a Cahoots model from Eugene, includes the STAR model from Denver. But at the end of the day, I am someone who is a member of Share the Cities and organized with King County Equity Now, and was in support of the 50% defund, recognizing that we have had near double of funding given to the Seattle Police Department since 2010. And so what we're saying is, okay, we tried that. We tried to just give the police more money. Didn't work out. Let's go back to that amount of funding and let's shift these resources in ways that can truly address crises in a way that is not a person with a gun. And so we want to maintain that 100% public safety and have less than 50% of that be the police. The biggest obstacle right now to that reimagining happening at all is our current mayor. We have just passed this, I want to say this past month, the third time that we have given the $12 million that is supposed to be going to our community partners in order to provide alternatives to public safety, after the mayor vetoed it twice last year. And so what I am focused on is working with council to be a mayor of action so that we can actually provide this public safety that a lot of people are waiting for.
Thanks. It seems like one of the other big obstacles is the police union, and their contract is up for negotiation, I believe, right now. So
Yes.
if you're elected, that will be probably still ongoing if the tradition
Mhm.
holds, probably for most of your term. What changes would you want to see in that contract, and how would you negotiate them?
Well, I can rely on some recently passed legislation, which helps a lot. If I remember correctly, it's 5506. That kind of takes some of the things that can be negotiated during the arbitration for police unions, and pretty much just boils it back down to solely negotiating over payment, which is great. It makes things a lot easier because the last contract, if you know, council back in 2017, as much as I appreciate the reforms that were passed, were then brought and rolled back through the arbitration process in 2018, and council still signed that contract. I don't find that acceptable. For me, it really comes down to, one, bringing back those levels of accountability that were brought in 2017, and recognizing that we need to have some hard lines when it comes to the amount of power that we are giving to the Seattle Police Department. One of the things that I have made very clear is that I am not interested in negotiating a contract so long as Mike Solon is still the president of SPOG. It is something where he has completely acted out of line, and in many cases almost incited violence himself. And I don't feel that any negotiation would be in good faith with someone leading the Seattle Police Officers Guild coming from that perspective. Same issue with the 6 officers who were at the January 6th insurrection. I am not interested in trying to reform a system that protects, in essence, I'm trying to think of the right word, really criminals, people who have violated the laws that they are supposed to protect. And so in that way, I want us to move to a point where we have a new contract that shows more accountability, but I have some pretty hard lines as to where I draw the line on true accountability.
Yeah. And you talked about Mike Solon.
Yeah.
You also, if you are elected, will be finding a new police chief.
Yes.
How would you go about that search process, and what will you be looking for?
So I want it to be a public process. I want the community to be involved. And of course, I want the CPC to be involved. That is what they're there for. It is something where that search ideally would be a nationwide search. I think we need to bring someone in who is not from the current environment, because the issues that have been with the police department have been existing inside the police department for over a decade now. And so we need some kind of fresh perspective in that way. And just how I'm trying to bring a fresh perspective to the mayor's office, we're going to need someone if we're truly going to try and reform the police department that we do have. And so that is coupled with recognizing the challenges with the consent decree, and really having almost a federal conversation as to, okay, what is the kind of leader that we need to see? Because at the end of the day, the police chief is in charge of SPD, and the mayor is then in charge of the chief. And so in that pecking order, recognizing that a lot of what is able to be negotiated and selected and really addressed and made accountable is through me.
Excellent. We're getting towards the end, so if anyone has more questions they would like to ask, they should throw them in the chat. I mean, we'll try to get to them. Getting a little, I guess, more general. When I think about your campaign, I keep thinking about that. There's a line about first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. Just because the media seems like they have been ignoring you, yet you also have done massive fundraising with through small donors. Mm-hmm. You've got an army of volunteers. Mm-hmm. It's only recently I feel like I've seen the Seattle Times start to use you as a scare tactic for conservative homeowners.
Ooh, you're an
Yeah,
ambiguously
so-
brown person who's going to come and upzone all your neighborhoods.
yeah, exactly. So like, how do you hope to overcome that, and why do you think that you're not being taken as seriously as your obvious enthusiasm for you merits?
Well, as much as I can only pin so much on me being Black and Latino and also queer, I think it comes with an expectation as to what a mayor is supposed to be, which I find is in some ways almost unfair. In other words, that this person is supposed to be perfect, that they're always supposed to say the right thing, that they're able to truly be the negotiator between all of these different interests, when we recognize, especially because the city itself is pretty democratic, that when we as Democrats or anyone further to the left try to negotiate with Republicans at the federal level, it just doesn't happen. And so I don't know why we're trying to set the same expectations for people, especially the mayor, to try to say, okay, well, you need to see both sides of a conversation, when there are so many people who are unhoused that we need to actually give shelter. In other words, some of these problems are so significant that we can't have any more nice conversations. And so what I think their fear is, in addition to that, is that they don't see the emergencies that we have as truly bad as they are. As I stated earlier, I'm running because we're in a climate crisis, we're in an economic crisis, we're in a housing crisis. And I recognize that all these things are connected as an architect to housing justice. And so I may be coming at this from a different lens as opposed to a career politician or a lawyer, but at a time where we have to make significant investments in not just housing, but also infrastructure. In less than 10 years, we need somebody who's a project manager like me. And so I hope, kind of to your point in the idiom that you use, that over time that we're starting to build this rising tide. And that's also why I named my campaign The Rising Tide, is that in essence, we are building a grassroots movement to lift all of our boats, but starting with those that are at the bottom first.
Great. I'm going to jump around a little bit because we have a couple questions that got thrown in the chat.
Yeah. And I got time, so like we can go. We're great.
Okay. All right. So if anyone else has any questions. All right. So what are your thoughts about the increasing the available labor pool for construction? Again, you're an architect, so you know, like one of the biggest issues is the cost. So they said
we need thousands of people. Like just straight up. I can say that back in 2019, when we were at the height of our building boom, that we simply could not find the number of people that we needed to actually construct things. And the one thing that is extremely concerning to me is the amount of affordable housing that we have to build. We, in essence, need to take our most productive year, which was close to 11,000 units of housing, and triple it for the next 8 years in order to close the gap. That is how much we need to do. And so that is part of why I created the income tax proposal that I have, which is called the Just Transition Tax. And you can see that on my website. That is focused on using funds from a progressive income tax to fund green apprenticeships. And in that way, we are building the new labor pool. We are providing our community a lot of really great union living wage jobs that can help us be actually achieve our goals. And in that way, we have that community of individuals able to build those communities.
Excellent. So the question asker's other question is, our current mayor has had tiny homes as part of their electoral platform. What about you and your experience will help you actually achieve the electoral vision? And then they also go on to thank you for laying out some of the details of your plan on your website.
Yeah, so that's precisely it, is that I am laying out details for every single policy point that I'm doing. We have 32 policy points. I think the biggest one, which I'm happy to talk about later as kind of a group and like do some organizing is, what does land use reform exactly look like? Because I know that it is something that requires community engagement, but that I want to have those conversations now and figure out all those issues now so that on day one, I can act. We have made it very clear about how successful tiny homes can be. And I think what really differs me from the current mayor is that I feel like in many ways, our current mayor is afraid to piss people off. And that is something I definitely am not afraid of doing. I am a Black architect in an extremely white profession. I just have to make space for myself. I have to be able to advocate for myself. And in many ways, that is myself advocating for marginalized groups. And so that is the kind of work that I'm gonna do. I'm going to fight to get these tiny home villages built because that is how we actually address our homelessness emergency as a true emergency.
Excellent. Again, if anyone has any questions, otherwise this will be the last question, but then if you want to ask questions or carry on the discussion, you're more than welcome to. If people listen to you during this hour and got inspired and were like, this is my man, I want to get involved, I want to help out, how can people plug in? How can people connect with your campaign? What do you need to help make it happen?
So my team is here and they started just putting things in the chat, so thank you. It is agh4sea.com, and that is the number 4. And so it is the same agh4sea.com or agh4sea on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And we definitely need tons of volunteers to help us. I know that with our democracy vouchers, we're pretty much set on that. But what I'm really focused on right now is just getting the message out about how myself as an architect and as a community organizer am truly focused on creating a different path to the one that we are currently going down on, because the current path is completely unsustainable and we need to move in a new direction so that we can truly become the Seattle that we always say that we are.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you so much for answering all your great answers to your questions. And
appreciate it.
Thanks for your commitment to our city. Like win or lose, I'm so happy that you're running, and I think it's the energy and time you're putting into making our city better is wonderful.
Yeah, it's funny because I think a lot of people, to your point earlier, are like, who the hell is this person? But if you've been organizing with me, you know who I am and you know what I'm committed to doing, and I'm gonna do it.
Oh yeah, it's been pretty apparent that the Seattle Times writers don't like pay attention to anything in the activist community or anywhere else.
Yeah,
they'd be taking you very seriously.
Well, thank you. So yeah, if anyone else has any other questions, I am more than happy to answer them. We could talk more about food. I was happy to do that too. All right, well, I think the last thing I'll say before we officially close out is that we're currently building out the land use reform platform. Oh, favorite Austin tacos. Okay. Oh, there's a few, and I only say that because there's different styles of tacos. So there's like white people tacos from Austin, which are like you go to Taco Deli and you get the Just Special. That is like what you have to get. And if you want more traditional ones, really anywhere in East Austin should be great. But I usually tell people to go to, oh man, I'm like forgetting out of my head. It's not Venezuela, but it's like, it starts with a V and it's on the east side. It's a green like truck and they have the best agua frescas. And then if you want a barbecue taco, because there are those two, you go to Valentina and you get those tacos. Those are amazing, like brisket tacos.
Excellent. So what were you saying about your land use platform that you started to?
So mine currently is pretty straightforward. It's like, okay, we need to allow for up to 8 units. You can build up to 45 feet. You can have an option for commercial on the ground floor, but that's kind of it for like blanket, and of course doing parking or eliminating parking requirements. So if there's anything else that you feel like should be included, I would be more than happy to have that information. So yeah, all your dreams. You want to just submit those through our comments section on the website, and if you just do that by Friday. But I am someone who has already done a lot of research. So, I mean, I have printed copies of the pedestrian master plan and the bicycle master plan and some other things as well. And like I said, I wrote land use code myself in the past. And so it's really mostly focused on just kind of diluting it down to something that a non-technical individual can actually understand. I think I saw another question.
Yeah, actually, there's a couple more that snuck in.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a few. How do you change the culture at SDOT to be more pedestrian friendly and stop building everything with a car lens?
So that is the goal of my multimodal master plan. So we need to actually start planning for cars, because right now the current modus operandi is that we just assume that cars are going to get first priority. And so I recognize that for many people, they also want to argue that because we have displaced people from Seattle, that those people need cars, which is true. But something that I want to really focus on when it comes to our planning is creating a business parking like medallion or sticker. And if people sign up for that and just say like, hey, I use my car specifically for business, I drive for Uber, Lyft, I do DoorDash, then we would be able to make parking free for them as long as they just have that license essentially that they renew. And then we would eliminate free parking across the entire city. So that's how you get people to drive less.
And Steve asks, what's your thoughts on pedestrian streets? Where should we put them, and why is there one next to every station? And then Jasmine asks, how do you plan to pedestrianize Pike Place?
How do I plan to pedestrianize Pike Place? Bollards. Really, it does take a little bit more coordination, which is that we need to actually get Uber and Lyft to set boundaries so that people can't get dropped off there anymore or picked up from there, because that is something that we know that they can do because they already do that for Capitol Hill. And so that's pretty straightforward and just needs to be articulated. But the other piece of it is we need to set clear standards for when pickups and drop-offs for produce and freight and other business happen, because then we're able to put up bollards and say, okay, now this is fully pedestrianized. It is something that we also need to do over here on Capitol Hill where I live. We've talked about a Capitol Hill superblock for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years now. And so let's actually do it.
Well, that's a flashback to the earlier question. Where once you pedestrianize Pike Place, where do you go next? Where's the next street?
We start with the work done by Seattle Greenways, which did all the stay healthy streets that people wanted to make permanent. So we start making places that are permanent, recognizing that, of course, myself as an architect, that you still need fire access in some places, but that we really need to start taking space away from cars and putting it back for people and making places where people can belong. Actually, First Avenue is a place that I have thought about a lot, honestly. Since we removed a bus from there, which I actually used to use when I first moved here to go to Uwajimaya, because they said they were going to put in the Center City connector and it still hasn't been finished, that First Avenue could be a really great option.
Oh, what about a pedestrian street with a streetcar running down it?
Yeah, why not? It happens in so many other countries.
Yeah. Seeing how we're in overtime, someone also asked, what's your favorite architecture in Seattle?
Oh, that is the Central Library.
Ah.
I really like it because it is something called, oh, what's the word for it? It's like hyper pragmatism, I want to say is the technical style, but they essentially took all the different activities and then just connected them with lines. And so I find in that way, it is a really great example of not making architecture too fussy, but also that because of the design of the skin is what you call it, or the shell, that it feels appropriate for a tech capital. Like it feels very much like, yeah, we are a tech city. Yeah, we are really great. Yeah.
Excellent. Good answer. Yeah, any other questions?
Oh, making places for where people belong. That actually is my slogan for my architecture practice. And also, I definitely will be looking for some work to do once I finish up with the council member at the end of May. So if anyone's looking for an architect.
So one of the things they could do to support your campaign is hire you as an architect.
Yeah, or just pay for my time. That we talked about it earlier, but that transit plan, like that took a lot of time, but I'm very happy to have done it. And what I was really trying to propose with that, which is like the SST 2040, and you can see it on my website, my professional website, is that we need to be having these conversations. That's why I've mentioned that we need to be bringing back neighborhood planning so that we can say, okay, we recognize that we want light rail to be a part of our community, that we think it's really great as an alternative to driving. So let's actually plan for it. Let's create a master plan for the light rail so we know what a complete, at least the next major complete, could look like, so that everyone also gets buy-in. Because something that I ran into a lot when I was organizing back in Austin is that you would have huge swaths of the city just not vote for transit because they never saw when their future was coming. And so if we invite citizens to be a part of that future and say, hey, where do you want to plan for a station? Then that gets them buy-in, and that is how we pass an even bigger town transit ballot initiative in the future, because I want to do that. So let's do that.
Excellent. So we got another question sneaking in overtime.
Yeah.
Would you support expanding the retail scheduling law to include hotel employees?
Retail scheduling law.
I think it's
Ooh.
secure scheduling, I imagine.
Yeah, I do know about secure scheduling, and yes, I think that makes sense. I think it's something where there really isn't an excuse for hotels to not provide secure scheduling because they have a lot of things that are booked in advance. It's also something where, in my mind, I want to plan for third shift workers, which I know a lot of hotel workers are third shift. And so in that way, yes, we should. And it is something that I'm thinking of.
Any other questions?
All right. Well, if you have any other questions, feel free to send them through the website. And also, you're welcome to see all the plans that are there. There are a lot of them, and there will be more coming, and they will be all out by the beginning of May. So happy to continue this conversation in the future. And of course, feel free to just @ me on Twitter.
Great. Well, good luck with the campaign ahead.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. And I look forward to future conversations.
Yeah.
Have a good evening.
All right. You as well. Thank you, everyone, for coming out.